Welcome to Spirit Journey Collective. I'm your host, Sarah Ty. Get ready for compelling conversations with guests of all walks of life who believe they have found their purpose. Together, we will uncover unique backstories, hearing the raw experiences that led them to the work they are doing today. Let's expand our minds together with the captivating stories and inspiration that awaits. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Spirit Journey Collective. I have a really wonderful guest today. Her name is Meagan Murtonen, and she's a podcast host and a subconscious mindset practitioner. I'm so excited to have her here. I was a guest on her podcast and had a great time. Thank you so much for being here today, Meagan.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining me. This is so cool. So why don't you share a little bit more about yourself, what you do and what you offer?
Yeah, so I am a certified mindset coach and I work with the subconscious mind. So we do a lot of modalities like hypnosis, EFT, so tapping, if you've heard of that. And it's called neural energetic encoding, which, if you've ever heard of neuro linguistic programming, it's based on that, but it's a more inclusive way of actually processing information. So neuro linguistic programming, or NLP, was made by some white men like in the 70s. And so it's very linear in the way of thinking, and it doesn't take in the fact that we all think about things in different ways. And so sometimes when we work with clients, they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm doing this right, because you think you have to do it in a certain way. And yet our subconscious always knows the answer. So whatever ways that our subconscious wants to give us information is perfectly okay. So this is a really cool way of using NLP, but to be more inclusive for the way that people actually think about things.
That's amazing. I think that so many of us get caught up in that linear thinking, right? Like A to B. Like there has to be that straight line where you have a start and a destination, but most of the time it's spiralic, right? Sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back, but it's all still moving forward in its own way. And I love that you encourage, people that you work with to do it their way, it sounds like. And I feel like then with that, there's no judgment. There's no sense of like, I'm doing it wrong, because everyone's doing it their own way. So, oh my gosh, I love that already. So I guess my next question is, how did you find this work? Is this something that you've always been drawn to? Is it something that you went to school for and like started from the beginning, or is it something you fell into later? I'd love to hear the backstory.
Yeah, so it is not something I ever saw myself doing. I was actually in the wedding industry for a very long time. I still technically do florals, but when I was 19, I started my first business in the wedding industry. And then, so I was a hair and makeup artist, and then I became a wedding planner. And then from there, I added flowers, and then I dropped the wedding planner. And it must have been during the pandemic, right at the beginning, I was like, I heard a podcast about NLP, and I was like, that's really cool. Like, you can rewire your brain. How do I do that? And so I was Googling everywhere, trying to find some techniques that I could just like listen to or work through, and I couldn't find anything. And so I did find a coaching program, and I was like, well, maybe I'll just take that program and I'll coach myself so that I can use these techniques so that I can actually help myself move forward in my floral business. Like, I wanted to get more into luxury florals and really get over the money mindset issues that come along with how much I thought I could charge, what my capacity was I good enough to be a luxury florist? And so that was my goal. But the second that I started to do these techniques through the program, I was like, everybody has to know about this. Like, it's so powerful and so potent that your life changes. And my mind just expanded so much. Like, I went from this narrow little view of how I saw the world and this like glass ceiling of what I saw as possible for me and really the world itself. And it just like shattered. And so that was only a few techniques, because every time we would learn a new technique, we would practice on each other. And so you're just doing like one technique for one belief at a time. And even just that, coming out of the coaching program, I had an entirely different view on the world and what I was meant to do in it. And I thought, I can't keep this to myself. So I had no intention of ever becoming a coach. I literally went in for selfish reasons to be my own coach. And then I came out with being like, people need to know about this, and people need to have access to this, and also not have to pay, $5,000 for a coach. I have a membership where people can access these at an affordable price, because it can get really hard when you're like, oh, I don't have $5,000 to pay a coach. Well, you know what? You can just come in here and access these techniques in a way where it's accessible to everybody, because I believe in women and what we can do when we rise up in this world and as a collective, and to be able to give more women access to the tools is my mission and my purpose.
Wow. That's so cool. It's funny. I see it over and over again. More and more people seem to fall into their calling versus like just knowing it right off the bat, which I find super interesting because many of us were kind of brainwashed to believe that we have to get out of college or get out of high school and know what we're going to do, and so we have to like check all the boxes, and most of the time when we do, it's like there's something missing. Either there's something missing and we have to go find it, or like in your story, you were doing something else for yourself. You were just learning and following, your own breadcrumbs. And all of a sudden it led you to, oh my gosh, there's so much more I could be doing that's more impactful. Not to say that being in the wedding industry, I'm sure you made lots of impacts with the brides and, the planning, but it's almost like you found a way to be more impactful in a bigger sense. So I love how you mentioned that you feel like this is your purpose and you really feel like you have acknowledged that. So what is it about what you do that lights you up, that makes you know for sure that this is what you're supposed to be doing, that you're right where you're supposed to be?
Yeah. So when I work with a client, especially when it's like one-on-one and I can see them on the other side, like literally you can see their physiology change when they go through these techniques, right? It's not so much to be like it's a little bit of conscious coaching where I'm talking them through and we're kind of softening up an idea that they might have in their head, like a belief, or loosening up kind of their model of reality through talking and coaching. But when you take them through a technique where they get to, for example, go back to the root cause of where their limiting event or their limiting belief came from, and then they take the learnings and they come out of that technique, and it's like you literally watch them go from suffering from that limiting belief that was like keeping them stuck, or their emotions were, in a more of a negative vibe, and you just see that change completely. And to literally just watch their whole, like their shoulders drop and they get the smile on their face and their eyes light up, and to see that change is like the most incredible thing, to know that you're like really making change. They're not just being like, yeah, that was great, thanks. Like, you made a difference.
I love that. Yeah, I like to say that purpose is a combination of two things. It's when you find the thing that lights you up, but also gives back to the world in some way. And in this case, it does both. It's really, really rewarding and fulfilling for you because you get to experience this, but then you also get to see how it, transmutes and actually impacts those that you work with. I would love to ask you, the membership that you offered, is that also one-on-one coaching too, or is that just the techniques?
Yes. So it's kind of a hybrid coaching where I offer them one-on-one. So as you go through the self-paced program, there's opportunities where it says, okay, book your next call so that we can actually talk and I can help them through the program, but help them with anything that's coming up. So I feel like the one thing that's lacking in a lot of like memberships or self-paced programs is that accountability. And most people need some sort of accountability in order to keep up, not the motivation, but just that, like, to remember their why, to remember why they're there in the first place. And if it's like, okay, it's time to book your call and we can talk through things and, get them pumped for the next section of the program. And I also offer group live calls as well. So we do bi-weekly group calls where we get in and we do some embodiment practices. And then, yes, I have the whole access to the self-paced program, and it comes with techniques that are pre-recorded or either audio or video that they can just work through on their own time as well.
Yeah, I have to agree. I feel like a lot of the different programs out there, it's like most of the time you get the self-paced, which is amazing. You get the group calls, but you don't always get the one-on-one with the coach themselves. And so that's really cool that you combine all of it. So that way the people you work with kind of feel like they do get a package. They do get a little bit of everything. Because usually, when someone purchases a program, they're not just purchasing the program, they're purchasing what you personally are offering. And so that sounds like you kind of bring it more to that personal level of, I'm not just expecting you to buy from me and then get these courses. I'm also right there holding your hand and helping you through it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually have a group chat as well. So like we're in there every day. Either I'm like sending a message saying like, here's something inspiring today. I sent them like just a morning activation that they could listen to. and then I'm in there answering questions. So obviously I have boundaries, so I'm not going to like answer at midnight. But whenever I see the messages and I have a moment to sit down, then I'm sitting and I'm replying to them or I'm sending a voice note because I really do feel like, and probably so many people like in business would be like, that's too much. You're offering too much. And it's like, but I'm offering what I know will truly help somebody. And I'm offering it at a price that everybody can afford for the value that I'm giving rather than trying to just get, a handful of clients at a higher price. Like I would rather be able to help more people and give it to them in this way where they truly feel like they have everything that they need.
Yeah, I understand. It's funny. I see kind of both sides because I know there is that, well, don't feel like you have to be small. Like sometimes this idea of if you offer what you do less, then you're playing small, and it doesn't always mean that you are though, especially if you feel like you're happy with what you're offering. I think that that's a big part of it is you have to feel like you're comfortable with what you're putting out in the world. You don't feel like you're getting less than what you deserve or whatever else. You feel like it's actually making an impact. Yeah. So I think that it's about doing what feels good to you, right? Because it's not going to be cookie cutter. I think that's the biggest lesson that I'm still trying to learn as my on my own as my own business owner in the healing slash service industry is figuring out like how do you do it your own way without feeling like you have to copy what everyone else is doing because everyone else would say, oh no, your prices are too low. But you're happy with it. And not only that, you're able to see, I mean, obviously you're getting clients, obviously and then not only that, but you're seeing the improvements in their lives, which is only going to bring more people to you because when other people improve, then you get the word of mouth and then you get more of that organic growth. And you're making a bigger impact. It's kind of like someone who did the one-on-one, who then decided to write a book, and then they're like, now I want to reach more people, right? It's kind of that same idea. You're just condensing it into like a membership and a course. What is one struggle that, or I mean, I'm sure you see many, many struggles, but what is like a main struggle, like one that you see more often kind of play over and over and over again? What's a main struggle that you see, and what's advice you give for that struggle?
Yeah, so there's a few like core limiting beliefs that I feel all women have. And these are subconscious, right? So we're not consciously going around thinking that we have these issues, but they stop us in ways we show up. So the first one is that we feel unworthy. And so again, we're not going around being like, oh, I feel so unworthy today. You feel worthy, like you feel like if you were to ask yourself, you're like, no, of course I'm worthy. But it shows up in ways where you don't feel like you're good enough to do the thing. You don't feel like you're well liked enough. You don't feel like people listen to you or see you. And the core of that is that truly you don't feel inherently worthy. Like you're waiting for validation. You're waiting for that next thing to prove to you that you're on the right path or that you deserve those things. And the truth is that we all came here inherently worthy. We are all worthy and whole. And then the beliefs that we've developed as we've grown up and as we've taken on what society tells us and our caregivers, we have felt less and less worthy based on other people's expectations that they make us think. And so we feel like we're not worthy. And so that stops us from doing the things like getting on an Instagram live because we think people are going to judge us. The reason we feel people are going to judge us is because we don't feel fully worthy. Because when you know that you are worthy no matter what, that you are 100% whole as your most authentic self, you actually don't care what people think. Like you get to this point where yes, you can recognize like not everybody's going to like me. Like you can kind of step into that villain area where you're like, I don't care if you don't like me because this is who I am. And when you're still kind of battling that worthiness wound, you can almost feel like, but who am I? Right? Like you don't really want to fully step into yourself because you're not certain that you're worthy enough to be her, if that makes sense. And so the other core belief is that we're unsafe. And this is like, I'm unsafe. It's a lot of fear comes from that. So if you're feeling like a fear of failure, a fear of success, even if you're feeling any sort of fear, it usually comes from an unsafe place. Like you don't feel like you're safe to have the money. You don't feel like you're safe to take that risk. You don't feel like you're safe to put yourself out there. Like something in you is saying like, that's not safe. When of course, in reality, we're not going around thinking like, oh, I'm not safe to go do this. Like it's this subconscious belief that stops you from doing these things. So once you can uncover what your limiting beliefs are, then you can go ahead and release them. And there are conscious ways to do this. There's lots of like questions you can ask yourself and kind of like proving to yourself, you know, when you ask yourself, say your belief was, oh, I'll never make that kind of money. Then it's like, okay, well, is that true for you or is that true for everybody? Because if it's not true for everybody, like someone like me can't make that kind of money. If that's not true for everybody, it's just a limiting belief because it's just the way you see what's possible for you. But if other people are doing it, then it means that, of course, it's possible for you too. You just have to learn the right strategies, have the right beliefs, like have the right mindset. And so when we're consciously working at it, it's asking those questions like, is it true for me? If it's not true, like, okay, well, why, what am I making this mean about me? Where did this belief come from? Like what happened in my life that might have made me believe this? You know, maybe your parents always told you like, oh, you can only do this. Like maybe your parents even said something to you like, you're not smart enough to be an astronaut. And so you feel like you can't expand into that. So little things that people say along the way make you feel these beliefs. And so when we go back to the root cause, though, using the subconscious mind, a lot of the times they are things that we don't consciously know about. So our subconscious stores all of our memories that we've ever had, not just our memories, but generational memories that get passed down and past life trauma as well. And so there are root causes that you could not possibly even know because it's not even your life. And so trauma actually does get passed down generationally. It shows up on brain scans. They've actually been able to see it on brain scans from past people. And so when you go to that root cause though, and you can actually release it there, everything beyond that is just a reinforcement. So if let's say your grandmother was, you know, who was in the wartime in the countries that were most affected by it, let's say like France, and she faced like starvation and famine and they were invading and you're going through a lot of trauma, like capital T trauma. And so now she has the beliefs that like there's not enough to go around, everything is scarce. And then you pass that, she passes that to her children, and then they pass it to their children, and that gets passed on and passed on. Not only do we consciously share these beliefs with our children because we say things like, oh, there's not enough, or eat all your food because we don't want to waste it. Any other abundance or scarcity things that just come out of our mouths, like, oh, we can't afford that right now. We're passing those down consciously, but we're also subconsciously passing on those beliefs from before. And every time we say those things consciously, we're reinforcing that belief. And so when we get to actually go back to that root cause, that first time that we ever developed a belief like that, we get to actually release it and take the learnings in a way that helps us positively go into our future lives. Does that all make sense? That was like a lot.
Yeah, no, that made a lot of sense. I definitely can attest to like so much that you're saying. Like personally, definitely as far as like the worthiness piece, because I do think that that is underneath everything. Whatever limiting belief we have, it literally stems to whether or not you deserve or are worthy of this thing. So I mean, I feel like that, like I've seen that even in my tarot readings, I'll see that too, is worthiness will come up a lot. And a lot of what you're speaking to, you're talking about, well, once I get this, then I'll be okay, right? That's a lot of how I read the lovers and the tarot cards. It's this whole idea of like, once I get, so like if you're looking at a relationship, when most people hear lovers, that's what they think of, right? So they're like, when I get in that relationship, when I fall in love, or when me and my partner get to this stage, then I'll be complete. And I mean, but that works for any area of your life, right? Like if you, once you get that promotion, once you lose weight, once you do this, then you'll be whole. But the whole idea is that, well, you already are whole, right? There's nothing you need to do. There's no carrot you need to chase. There's nothing out there that's going to fill you up the way that you can already create for yourself now. So it's a lot of what I already teach as far as like the lovers, but it sounds like you help people really see that by getting investigative and uncovering that subconscious that we're not even aware of, right? I mean, it's so interesting because I definitely struggle with, it's, you know, I think a lot of business owners and those in the healing and service industry can relate to that feeling of like, well, who am I to go live? Who am I to be successful at what I do? That is definitely, I mean, I have those thoughts as a, as a healer and business owner, like that definitely crosses my mind. But I love that you asked that question. Well, if it's not true for everyone and only for you, then that means it's just a limiting belief. And I love that because it makes it so clear that it someone else could be successful at it. There's no reason why you can't. So it's now let's get curious about why we don't believe we can. And so that just really makes it easier to ask, to figure out where is it coming from, and not believing in it initially, because our mind can be so believable sometimes. So, and then it's so fascinating about generational trauma, because maybe what you think is the thing that's holding you back isn't even it. Maybe it's only your conscious version of it in this lifetime, but there's actually so much more underneath. I never even thought about that aspect either. So is this something that, as far as like so as far as these struggles, as far as like is it just really that the different techniques that you offer that allow you to dig deep and work through those struggles?
Yeah. So, like I said, you can do this work consciously. It's just not as deep. It's a little bit more surface level, and there's a little more like talking yourself into it or through it, where it doesn't happen as fast, right? Like when you work at the subconscious level through these techniques. So, going back into your timeline to find the root cause is neural energetic encoding, and you work with your timeline and the way that your brain stores information. And excuse me, there's things like hypnosis, which speak directly to your subconscious mind, because your subconscious mind has no logic filter. It takes everything that you say to it as truth. And so it also doesn't process negative. So if you were like, I want to get out of debt, all it hears is debt. It doesn't hear want to get out of. So that's why you would want to say, like, I want $10,000 if that's like what you owe in your credit card. You wouldn't want to talk about the debt. And so this is why it's really important to use positive language. But when we're working with our conscious mind goes, you're never going to get out of debt. You're never going to have $10,000. Like you've never had that before. Why do you think you can do this all of a sudden? There's like a logic filter, right? It's what keeps us safe. Safe, I say in quotes, like air quotes there. And so when we work with our subconscious, where there's no logic filter, we're just what you say, it takes as truth. And so there's nothing that you have to bypass, or we are bypassing, sorry, the logic filter is what I call it. And that means that you can implement change automatically. So when you're doing stuff like hypnosis, even some visualizations where you're entering a theta brainwave state, a really good time to do hypnosis or visualization is like the second you wake up in the morning, because you're still in that like sleepy state. You know how sometimes you wake up and you're like dreaming, but you're actually awake? And it's like that brainwave state where you're like, when you do hypnosis, you are consciously awake. Like somebody could come up to you and be like, hey, what's happening? Like you're not unconscious, you're not unaware, but you're also just like in that weird kind of sleepy state. And that's the easiest way to start rewiring in a positive way. And then, yeah, to release, we would do stuff like neural energetic encoding. There's a cool technique called you collapse an anchor. So if you have a negative belief or feeling, you can collapse that and actually input positive ones instead. And so every time you think about that old belief, you would actually start having the positive feelings instead. And this is really cool. And I just did that. I do it all the time now, actually, probably weekly at least. I'm like, oh, got to collapse that belief because that's holding me back. But it's a really cool one because I just did it yesterday, I think it was. And now I honestly can't even remember what the old belief was because I collapsed it. And now I only feel like the positive feelings. Like I don't even remember, couldn't tell you what it is because it's gone. So it's the coolest thing that you get to do these techniques and just bypass it all.
Yeah, that's really cool. That reminds me a lot of when you're talking about your logic filter. That's basically the ego, right? What
Mhm.
we would call the ego. It's so interesting. I was reading the book The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and he basically says the ego is not helpful because it's trying to be helpful, but it's also doing it in such a way that it's actually just damaging us, and it's, it's trying to make us feel safe, like you were saying, but actually it's making it worse. I mean, I think the ego has a place, like it has a job, but I think that it's just over the top now. Like it needs to sit back down.
I was just going to say, touching on ego, like I hate the word, I hate that we call it the ego because it can get confusing between like your ego, like your big self-centered self. And like, that's not what it is. I feel like it can get confusing where people are like, no, I don't have an ego. And it's like not the same thing. So that's why I feel like when you call it the logic filter, it makes so much more sense. So it's just processing all information and trying to make it make sense. Like that's what your ego does, is it just tries to make the information that you're seeing and taking in make sense to your model of reality.
Okay, that makes, yeah, yeah. I used to think that way too. I think probably because I've been now in like the more spiritual personal development realm for a while, that I hear the ego and I'm like, oh, that's your mind,
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Those that don't know are gonna be kind of offended, if
Yeah.
they're like, what are you talking about? I'm not egotistical. Like, no, 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 it's not the same. But
It's time to take a short break from our wonderful speaker. Are you in the need of guidance around love, career, family, life, or purpose? Embark on a spiritual journey inward with an intuitive tarot reading. Depending on what you're needing and looking for, I offer private one-on-one sessions as well as personalized email readings. It doesn't matter what the question is. A reading with me provides connection with your higher self, offering curated personal messages, or what I like to refer to as spiritual roadmaps, guiding you to the future outcome you desire. Readings are insightful and affordable. If you'd like more information or to schedule a reading with me, please see the link below.
I wanted to ask you, so one of the things you were talking about was like, so let's say I want to get out of debt, for instance, right? But your subconscious only hears debt. They don't hear the positive actions that you're trying to implement, right? So what is a different way you'd recommend phrasing that if you were in a position where you're trying to shift from like lack mentality to abundance mentality? Like what is a way that you would recommend shifting that or rephrasing that maybe?
Yeah. So in that sense, like in that example, it would be like, how much money are you in debt? 25,000. Okay. So you're going to want to call in $25,000 to get out of debt. So instead of saying, I want to get out of debt, you would say, I want to make $25,000. I'm going to make $25,000. I'm going to make $25,000. And really ignoring the fact of what you're going to do with that $25,000. It's just the fact that the positive is that I'm going to have that, because that's the positive way of writing it. So another example, if you were like, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. If you said that like in a hypnosis script or something, your mind would actually take it as I'm afraid. So you have to be very conscious, and like, no, not everybody can just write hypnosis scripts either, because there is a certain language that you use to speak within your mind. And so, yeah, you could definitely walk away feeling the opposite of how you actually want to feel, because you used not or negative words in a hypnosis script instead of the positive versions of it.
Okay. So it's really just focusing on what you're wanting and not what you're
What you
trying to
don't
move
want.
away from. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because I mean, I do think that there's like that slippery slope of like spiritual bypassing where like or toxic positivity where you're so positive that you're like ignore the things that actually need your attention. But I do think that it's important to know what it is you're trying to do and not just focusing on, well, I'm afraid to talk to these people that I know will, potentially become clients, for instance, right? And then you're like, because you're afraid, either you talk to them and you totally bomb because you're already in your head about being afraid, or, you go into it more from like I am going to go talk to these people and make friends and maybe make some clients, but not from like, but you don't acknowledge the part that's holding you back, I guess, if that makes sense. So kind of like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And on that, like, toxic positivity is like not feeling your feelings, right? It's trying to ignore your feelings. And being positive in the way that you speak about what you want doesn't mean that you don't have feelings, because you can say, I want $25,000, and that can still feel really scary, and it can still feel really unsettling to want that. Like you can still feel scared about the debt that you have, but it's that when we are trying to think about what we do want, and I mean, consciously you can say, I want to get out of debt because your conscious mind knows not, right? It knows that word. But when you're working with a subconscious mind is when you specifically want to ignore saying stuff like that. But yeah, even if you can just in your regular day life, try to rephrase things. And it doesn't have to be like one and done, everything's perfect. You can say, I want to get out of debt, and then say, no, actually, I want $25,000, right? Like your mind is not taking count of what everything that you say. It's going to go by like the last thing that you said. So if you say, oh, I want $25,000 after, like if you corrected yourself and you like chose again to like make your statement better, it's not like keeping track of like, oh, but you said debt. It's going to take like that last thing that you're focusing on and then just reinforce that.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good to know, because our mind does like to sometimes run off on its own, and then you have to catch yourself and recorrect. So it's nice to be like to know that, okay, it doesn't mean that just because you thought it, now everything's falling apart. It just means that you caught yourself and now you could just reframe.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you're not like that powerful of a manifester where you like have one thought and then it just shows up in front of you and it's like everything you don't want. Like it's when you focus on something and put a lot of attention on something. So if you're constantly thinking about debt, you're going to give yourself more debt because all you're thinking about is the debt. But if you think about it and you're like, oh shit, I have all this debt, and then you're like, no, okay, yes, it feels scary, but I am working towards paying it off by calling in this $25,000. And then, of course, taking action, because though we can manifest money out of nowhere, it does require action in many forms. And so it's like, how am I going to bring that in? Okay, well, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and then focusing on those actions. And most importantly is like focusing on the person that you need to be to achieve that $25,000. And that kind of goes back to that imposter syndrome that you were speaking about earlier. When we feel imposter syndrome, it's because we're like in the middle of becoming who we want to become and being who we are now. And it's like you're not quite at that next level. You haven't taken out all the beliefs or adapted all the new habits. And so it feels off because we don't believe that we're that version of ourselves yet, because we're not, but we're trying to be. And so it's like this like discombobulated feeling of being who we were for so long, but wanting that next step. And so even though we're taking action, like we don't see ourselves as that person yet. And so that's when we can go in and be like, okay, well, how does that version of me think, act, feel? What does she do every day? And really starting to think that way and do those things. And the more that you do those things and the more you think those thoughts, then all of a sudden you're like, of course I'm this version of me. Of course I don't feel imposter syndrome anymore because I am this version. I am a coach. I am a wedding planner, like whatever it is, right? And you start to like step into that version. It's like this, I know you can see me on camera, but for anybody listening, it's like this like almost a timeline of this version of who you are right now, who you want to be, and like this stepping in the middle where you're kind of pulled back and forth and you're like trying to get there. And of course you don't fully believe you're that person yet because you're not at that next level yet. But the more and more you do the things, the closer you get to becoming her.
Yeah, I love that. That kind of comes back to that inherent worthiness, right? Like whatever it is you're wanting to become, you technically already have it within you. It's just more about fostering it. That reminds me a little bit. Have you ever heard of the book called The Abundance Project?
I think I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
So it's by someone, I think his name is Derek Rydell. I hope I got that right. But he did this like experiment for himself where he every single day for a month, he lived as if he was where he already wanted to be. And it just completely changed his life. And that's basically what he teaches and talks about now is, is in like showing up as the person you already want to be. And I know that does come with, like you said, you still have to feel your feelings. You still have to acknowledge when you feel uncomfortable, but doing it anyway and still feeling like you can, like that person's already you. And then it's like shifting your belief from that person feels impossible to become to, no, she's already me, or he's already me, or whatever, like that's already me. So there's no reason I can't be that person now. It's all about mindset, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's two things. That one thing is, yes, when you're like, I'm going to live that way, that doesn't mean like, oh, I'm going to go out and buy a new car and I'm going to spend all this money. Like, I think that's really important to make a point of, because people think that they're like, oh, they're telling me to be like my future self. So my future self would go and buy a luxury handbag. Like, that's not what we're saying. We're saying like taking on the feelings of that person, like take the risks that that person would take, invest in a course that that person would take, do the things that actually get you to be that person. And along the way, it's feeling those feelings and really being aware and tuning into, why am I feeling this feeling? Because that's going to tell you why, like, where your limiting beliefs are. What am I feeling about being this person or doing that thing? Like, why am I scared? If there is a course that you want to invest in and you're like, oh, I don't know, I don't really have the money, like I could afford it, but I'm feeling like really like resistance to that. Like, I feel maybe afraid that even if I take it, like I'll fail it, or it's not going to help me, or it's going to be a waste of money. Like, those are all good signs of like where your limiting belief is. And I mean, part of that would be about the money and like spending money on yourself. But that also comes down to like the worthiness of like, I'm worthy of spending money on myself. I am enough. I'm smart enough to do the course. I will figure it out. And so there's like all these things that come in. And when we can sit with ourselves and be in awareness of the thoughts and the feelings that are coming up, then we know how to move forward. And if we're not doing that, if we're trying to ignore the feelings and trying to be happy all the time and falling into that toxic positivity, then we aren't doing ourselves any favors, because we're not growing. The only way we're going to grow is if we can use those triggers as like a mirror to be like, where can I grow from here?
Yeah. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Yeah, even Derek Rydell, when he explained what he was doing, it was just he was embodying the feelings of what it would be like to be his future self. So for him, he was working as a waiter, and he just worked every day as if he did what he already loved to do. Even though it wasn't what he loved to do, it wasn't his dream job, he showed up every day like he was working his dream job. And that's kind of what catapulted him forward. But he didn't go and buy the car, or buy the house, or go in debt for trying to emulate it. He literally went from within. He started inside and worked his way out, versus trying to work outward to work your way in. Like, it doesn't work that way. Yeah, and I loved how you explained too the difference between pretending like your feelings aren't there, or versus, investigating and acknowledging and doing something with those feelings. And being more and curious, right? Being more curious about why do you believe what you believe around this? And, is there something holding you back here? So I love that. I'd love to take the time now to switch to what I like to call synchronicity story time. It's my favorite part of the podcast, just because it's just so magical. Do you have any fun synchronicity stories that, just line up perfectly, that you can't explain, that you'd love to share with us today?
Yeah, I have a whole life worth of them, because I think that literally everything in our life sets us up for the next thing. Like, every person that you meet eventually leads to something that you're supposed to be doing. But one of them is how I met my husband. And it's funny because we're both from Ontario. I am from Niagara Falls and he was from Sault Ste. Marie, which is very far up north. But he was living on the West Coast because he's in the Navy. And so he was working in Niagara Falls because he took a posting that was inland in the Great Lakes. And before, like, skip forward to even before that, I was dating somebody else, and he had a child. And so after we broke up, one night, his like baby mama, that's truly what she is, was like, oh, come out with us, like come out with us or whatever. And I was like, okay, sure. Like, I'm not going to meet anybody sitting at home, so sure, I'll go out with you. And I did, and it was awful, and I would never go out with her again. But I met her friend, who I actually really did like. And so a couple days later, her friend was like, hey, do you want to come to her boyfriend's hockey game? She's like, do you want to come? And I was like, okay, sure. Other person wasn't going to be there. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And so her and I started becoming really great friends. Well, her brother was also in the Navy, and he was visiting home. And so one night they invited Jordan, my husband, over. And so Veronica met him. And then she's like, I'm going to set you up with him. And I was like, you can invite him over, but I am not going to, like, don't count on anything, you know, like, whatever, invite him out. And so of course, we ended up getting married, but that wouldn't have happened if I didn't date that person and say yes to these like other opportunities that I normally wouldn't have done. Like, why would I go out with my ex's baby mama, who, like, that's the best way to describe her? Why would I do that? But something was just like, just go out, because, like, why not? And so we ended up doing that. And then I do have another story. When we bought our house, and it's a dream house for us. It has like everything on our checklist, like down to a T. However, there's so many things that actually lead up to this happening, but I'll try to make it short. So we were renting, and our landlord was a little mentally ill. And so I think, like, just the pandemic, and she was working from home and never was leaving the house, and she was drinking too much, and it just got crazy. And then this homeless person started living with her, and they would fight all the time, and it was just like very stressful, and the cops were called all the time, and it was just insane. And so we had a big payment come in, so we knew we were going to buy a house eventually, but we were kind of like waiting. And then all this was going on, and there was just one night where the cops were called. He actually ended up taking a ladder to her top window of like the third story floor when she was out. And he he didn't really break in. He just like opened the window because she didn't think anybody was going to be going into her third story window. And he went in there, and then it was like this big thing. Like, honestly, it's the craziest story ever, but we were just like, it's time to look for a house. Like, we can't do this anymore. Like, we were in fight or flight all the time, like waiting for their next fight to happen. Are the cops going to be called? Like, do we have to call the cops tonight? And so we ended up finding this house, and we weren't even going to see it. We were like, oh, it's out of our budget, but we were like, let's just go see it anyways. And we ended up getting it for the exact price that would fit within our budget. And then first, the bank was like, oh, we're not going to give you this much of a mortgage. So we figured it out, though. We were like, okay, we'll have to put a little bit of a bigger down payment on. We won't have as much to put into the house to like do stuff up, but that's fine. Like, we'll figure it out. So anyways, we had an accepted offer for the price that we wanted. And then the bank came back and was like, actually, we're going to give you more of a mortgage. So we actually ended up with more money than we would have had in our account if that didn't happen. So it actually ended up giving like us $20,000 like back in our bank account, which if the bank would have originally said that, we wouldn't have had that, like the way that it worked out. So we ended up having more money back in our account to put back in towards the house. And then we got the house for like way less than his asking price, because he was just like ready to get out of here, the seller. And so it literally just worked out in the perfect timing. Like, we have a huge yard, which is what we were like really looking for. We have a 5-year-old, almost 5-year-old, and a dog, and we just really needed space, and it worked out perfectly. So there's just so many things, like, when you think about, I could literally tell you my whole life and how everything added up. So I won't, because we'd be here forever. But it's just like all those little things that when you think about it, when you like really think about it, you're like, oh, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened. Like, they all seem insane at the time. Like, it was not fun going through that with my landlord, but like, it happened because it was like a kick in the butt, where it was like, get out of here. Like, this is the time to go right now, because there's this house like waiting for you. And so, yeah, crazy.
Yeah, I love that. That does happen a lot when you think about, like, when you look back, that's when you see most of the synchronicities. It's when things just happen and line up perfectly, and you can't explain how it worked out. But yeah, it sounds like the universe was doing that. It was like hitting you guys with a 2x4, like a spiritual 2x4, like, hello,
Yeah.
you could choose to stay here, but there's something better. And
Yeah.
yeah, that does happen a lot, where it's like getting your attention, not always in the greatest way, because sometimes, synchronicities can initially be negative, and it's more just to get your attention, like you said. So I'm actually glad you shared that part of it, because so many people think synchronicities is always the good, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's the get out, like your scenario. It's you reach a point where things happen, and then once you finally listen, then the doors open, right? Because you weren't supposed to be in that situation any longer than you were anyway. So I love that story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then how you met your husband. That's so cool. I mean, definitely not something you hear all the time, right? Some going out with your ex's ex.
Yeah, my ex's baby mama, and then that was awful, right? Like the breakup was awful. The little boy was 2, and I had been with him since he was like 6 months. So like that was awful for me because I was like a parent to him more than it was with my ex, like and whatever about him. But the breakup just in general sucked. And then the evening out, I was like, this is like not my scene, awful. And but then it was like just led to the right things where because I was listening to my intuition, I was like, you know what? Guess who I'm not going to meet? Nobody. I'm going to meet nobody if I sit at home and do nothing. So like what have I got to lose? And I think it's like really important to ask yourself that is like, well, what have I got to lose? Because at the end of it, like you could sit exactly where you are, or you could see what happens.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Especially when you have a little push in that direction that you can't explain. That's like, yeah, I might as well go out. I mean, yeah, if you could say no to it, but if you did, it may have, see, I like to look at 2 different ways. Like either you might not have met your husband or it may have been delayed to another point in time. Right. And so in this case, it was like you listened and you didn't quite know what it was yet, but in hindsight, you're like, oh my gosh, thank God I listened.
Yeah, I don't see how it would have even been possible to meet him if it wasn't for Veronica, because he was only in that posting for a couple of years and then he would have been back on the West Coast, right? So it's like if we weren't connected in that way, like I would have never ran into him. He never went out anywhere. Like he was like a loner, just sat at home. He worked and like sat at home because he didn't know anybody, right? Like he was just like in this temporary posting where he only knew a few coworkers. And so he only went out, like she asked him like, oh, come out. And he was like, oh, okay. Like kind of also hemmed and hawed about like coming out because he was like, I don't really know her. Like sure, I guess I'll go, right? Kind of same thing. Like, what am I going to do at home? And so, yeah, I honestly don't think we even would have met if it like didn't line up like that, because how else would I have met him if he never went anywhere? And then he was going to move back to the West Coast. And I had no plans on ever moving to the West Coast until I had met him. So crazy.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love it. So the final question I love to ask everyone is, do you believe that everyone here on earth has a purpose?
I do. I think that all souls come here for a reason. And I think that our life, when we actually live in alignment and listen to our intuition and listen to the things that the universe is telling us, like the signs, and taking those little whispers and being like, go out, do this, do that, it leads you to discovering your purpose. When I was just in the wedding industry, and I would always think like, people always talk about your purpose. I'm like, I don't know that like I have this like great purpose, because I'm in the wedding industry, and like, is my purpose to like give people great weddings? I mean, like, sure, maybe, but it seems so like not meaningful. Like, sure, it's great, but it's like not also meaningful. Like, I want to make like an impact. And people have their wedding days and then they forget about me, right? Like, of course, they're not going to be like, remember our wedding planner? She was so fantastic, like 10 years later. Um, but they will remember me as a coach. And so I do feel like when you just like listen and you give in and you stop trying to push and force and make everything go your way, that is when you discover your purpose, because you're just allowing things to happen for you instead of thinking everything is happening to you in the worst ways.
Yeah, I agree. That's a sense of, that's basically surrender, right? Where you're trusting that there is a higher power. What is it? I think I heard it on another podcast where he says that we live on the corner of free will and destiny, which I love that. Sometimes our free will gets in the way where we think that it has to be this big grandiose thing. And sometimes it's not really, it's living the day-to-day thing. But when you surrender, that's when other doors open where you can find it. And I think that when you're able to surrender, again, if we think it has to be a big thing, then we might miss the doorways that get us to where that place, like I mentioned earlier, it's whatever's fulfilling and giving back to the world. I mean, it could be as simple as being an artist, right? You could be an artist, and to you, you're doing what you love, but then you're also giving beauty in the world. You know what I mean? And sometimes we feel like purpose has to be this big grandiose thing, and it's not. It's about what's fulfilling to you and giving back to the world, and then being able to release these ideas of what it should be. And then, with that surrender piece and trusting that it's not necessarily what our human mind thinks it is, right? And handing it over to something bigger.
Yeah.
So
I think like when you know too. Like for me, I knew that it wasn't my purpose to be in the wedding industry, where other people might be like, this is my purpose. Like I am so good at this. And like I was good at it, but I knew that it wasn't the thing. And I think again, when you just like keep listening to just the little whispers, it still might not all make sense right away. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, this is it. This is my purpose.
yeah, 100%. That was me in tarot. In fact, I said no to it several times
Yeah.
because I was like, I can't be a tarot reader. Like what? And then I started doing it and I was like, oh my God, this is it. This feels like me. I'm seeing the difference it's making. And so it was just like it was like a puzzle piece came together. And that's kind of what it feels like. And so again, it's kind of surrendering to letting yourself find it the way you're meant to find it instead of taking two pieces and trying to, force it together that could not even be the right piece. So I love that. If our listeners want to, work with you or sign up for your membership, how can they find you?
Yeah, so I am meaganmurtonen.com for the membership, and you can find all the information there. But on Instagram, I'm Meagan Murtonen, and on TikTok, I'm Meagan.Murtonen.
Perfect. I'll be sure to put all of that in the show notes. And thank you again, Meagan, for joining me today. I mean, I loved our conversation when I was on your podcast. And also, why don't you share with the listeners how they can find your podcast too?
Yeah, so my podcast is the Highest Self Academy. It's on Apple or Spotify, and there's some really good self growth things there. So yeah, you can find me there.
Yeah, check her out because I've been a listener now for a little bit, and I really enjoy the wisdom it comes in because sometimes it's just you that shares, and sometimes you have guests like I was on and other guests that share about all sorts of different uplifting and personal development things. So yeah. So I'll be sure to put all that in the show notes, including her podcast. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me again today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me on another inspiring episode. Remember, your purpose is a unique and unfolding path. I hope these conversations have ignited a spark within you. Until next time, keep exploring, growing, and embracing the beautiful adventure of connecting with your purpose. Stay tuned for more meaningful conversations. If you enjoyed the episode today, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And thank you for joining me on this journey.